Before I get to the main body of the presentation, though, I want to make sure we're all on the same page with a reference point, a very important reference point, and that is the structure, really, of any communist operation. And this structure I got from Bella Dodd. I don't know if you're all familiar with her. Bella Dodd was the chief counselor for the New York City Communist Party in the 40s. She left, I think, 1949 and became a Catholic, brought into the church by Fulton J. Sheen, Bishop Sheen, in the 50s. Around that time, she spoke before both the Senate and House committees that were investigating communist activities in the country, so I would consider her an authority on it. She describes the structure as follows: 3 elements: party, movement, and ideology. And I don't have a graphic for this, so you're going to have to mentally create one. I would, if I were you, imagine a target with the party at the center, appropriately in red. The next band around the party was what's called the movement, and then on the outer rim, the ideology. I'm going to nail down some brief definitions of those. The party is what the communists themselves call a cadre, a highly trained, tight-knit group of trained professional revolutionaries. These are the brains and heart of the communist operation. These are where the ideas come from. These are trained scholars in communism or longtime veterans of street activities and so on. The next level is the one you've probably seen most. You know about the party, but you haven't seen it. The movement is what you do see. The movement is made up of committed but not card-carrying communists. They may be card-carrying members of other groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center, National Organization for Women, Sierra Club, ACLU, and today Black Lives Matter and Antifa. When you see on TV a talking head from one of these organizations, they are committed movement members. They may or may not be card-carrying anything, but they're definitely high enough in the structure of what they're doing to be consulted on TV shows and things. So you see that, you're looking at movement members. The outer rim of this, the outer area, is called ideology. And ideology technically means the entire set of ideas and beliefs of the communist system. But as Dodd is using it here, it means those people who are invested in one or more aspects of the ideology. They're more or less aware of what it is. Some are very aware. I would say most are not very aware. They're either more committed or less committed, but some part of the ideology attracts them. I would describe as your typical Democrat voter. You ask them, do you know anything about Marx? No. Well, why are you voting this way or that way? And they'll give you a laundry list of things that you can actually find in communist literature. And we'll do more with that as we go. All right, as to move into the presentation proper. Anytime you're joining any kind of an organization, there has to be a first contact. And I will describe my first contact with the communist movement and I think what would be typically the way that people move into it. In the contact stage, there's no training being done. You just get an invitation to various events, functions, and so forth and so on. The purpose of this is just to get warm bodies to their events and functions. That's all they're doing. They will tell you at this point whatever you want to hear. In my case, back in the late 60s, they claimed that they weren't anti-American. They wanted to improve America, make it more just. They didn't want any winner in Vietnam. They just wanted peace. Now, through that whole first contact, you're in the ideological level. My interests were that they weren't anti-American and that we didn't get booted out dishonorably from Vietnam. But it was enough to get the hook in. After a brief time, and if you see them on, I should put this in. My contact with them was in two ways. I was in a rock and roll band at the time, and they were frequently at those concerts. And the other thing was there were a series of coffee houses in Pittsburgh where I lived, reminiscent of the old coffee houses. In fact, some of them were the old coffee houses of the 50s with the beatniks and the, bongo drums and poetry and all that sort of stuff. And they would frequent those because they would find fellow travelers like myself in there. At that stage, they're going to make more information or more invitations to things, requests to keep in touch, exchange contact information, always discussing shared interest. Now, you think that's just conversation. What they're doing is finding out what your real interests are, what they can use you for, and they're building mutual trust. The whole idea of this phase is to identify those among the large group out there who are of interest, or better yet, of use potentially to the Communist Party. That may go on for an indefinite period of time, but eventually they have to close the deal. You know when they've closed the deal, or when they're closing the deal, when you start getting invitations, not to just attend events and things like that, but invitations to help with recruitment. Do you have friends who might be interested? How about family members? Any way that they can expand their circle. They may ask you to help with the actual distribution of materials, handing out flyers and so forth. In my band, they directly ask me to let them come up on stage and do talks in between sets and things like that. Or if they really see some potential in you, they may ask you to help with not the distribution, but the creation of materials, flyers, literature, and so on and so forth. While this is going on, what's happening in their mind is you're transitioning from ideological to movement, from one level to the other. And in that movement level, you're going to be assisting in organizing and coordinating events. Again, in my case, often built around band activities, volunteer work. The band played many free concerts that were either sponsored by the communists or in which the communists would come up and do some talking to the people. Another characteristic of this area, this phase, is a deepening of access to inside information. The information they were giving you up to this point was stuff you could probably read in the newspaper. Now, as you're getting into the movement more deeply, you're also starting to get access about what they're planning on doing, how they're planning on doing it, what their strategy is, things that you would not read in the newspaper, things you'd have to know from them. As this is going on, and as far as I went was the movement. I didn't get past the movement level for reasons I'll give you later. During this phase, you're going to start getting introduction to techniques, and that's going to continue through your association with them. Even if you move into the party, you're going to get first notice of what kind of techniques they're going to use. They call stunts. A stunt is some demonstration intended to achieve some purpose. And I'm just going to list randomly a couple of things that I got into at that point. One thing they ask you to do is infiltration of or planting in crowds. They get maybe one individual if they have one gutsy enough. Generally, it's 2 or 3 individuals. They're going to go to, say, in the last few years, would go to a Tea Party meeting or something like that, to infiltrate that group or simply be planted in some occasion in the crowd. But the intent was to carry out 2 kinds of operations. One of them was discrediting from within, and that's a Leninist term. That's from Vladimir Lenin. Discrediting from within would be like going to a GOP rally or a Trump rally and carrying a very offensively racist plaque or sign, something with maybe vulgarity directed at immigrants and things like that, to make you look like you're part of that group and to get that group associated with what you're saying there. Of course, you're not from that group. You're from the communist group. The other operation is just general disruption. If you can get somebody in the group to make some catcalls or interrupt the speaker to ask inappropriate questions, questions you think they won't be able to answer, pin them down, trap them, any way of disrupting the flow of what they call an enemy event. You're the enemy, by the way. That's you. This is not politics for them. This is not just a standard sort of social movement. This is war, and they make that very clear as they've closed the deal and you get into the movement. You're at war. And so I will refer to the enemy fairly often in here, and when I say that, that's you. Another thing that would be a little more advanced than just what I described is more open interruption of enemy speakers by showing up now as a large group. You're not just 2 or 3 people just randomly sort of sparsely interrupting. Now it's a planned, interruption involving maybe 30 people show up as a group, or a dozen, or whatever they can get, you're instructed here to bring pots and pans, whistles, learn chants, sing, do anything that makes noise to drown out the speakers, to ideally force them to leave the stage. Today, things like that, you see them directed at Ann Coulter. You read about them all the time, or other conservative speakers. Back then, in fact, after I left the movement, I witnessed Jean Kirkpatrick, who was either had been or at the time was Reagan's UN ambassador, and she was hooted off the stage at Pitt University by the same tactics. A large group of people got into the more or less conservative crowd that wanted to hear her speak, and they didn't hear her speak because she got drowned out. By the way, while we're talking about that, one tactic, I don't know if it's a tactic or just a tip, advice that they gave, and this I think you really need to know. We were told to avoid public arguments with the enemy, because the public, at least at that time, will always agree with the enemy. What you have there, and what they described, was what's called a Socratic dialogue. Socrates used to teach by engaging a student in a discussion, in a dialogue. So there are two elements, the teacher and the student. But the third element, and the one that Socrates said was far and away the more important, was the audience. The whole performance is aimed at getting something across to the audience. So you do a Socratic dialogue only when you're sure you can win, when it's a professor against a student or something like that. But if you're going to do that in an open forum, be prepared for the public to side with the conservatives. That's what we were taught. Moving on to more tactics. One of the things we did, and this one is another one I think you need to know about when you're seeing it, know what it is. There was always a plan for the redeployment of demonstrations, taking some kind of evasive action. Now, the way this typically worked back then, and I'll comment on how it works today in a minute, but the way it worked back then was we would get a large group of people together, and we're going to have an illegal demonstration. We're going to block traffic. We're going to block access to some public building. Whatever it is, we're going to do something that's going to get the police involved. Okay? We know that. So what we do in advance is set up 2 or 3, sometimes more. Typically, it was about 3 alternate areas. So we would have a lookout, and when the police would be sighted, a signal would be given that the police are on their way. And when the police came in sight, we would be given orders to, well, it was usually just, okay, man, let's split. You heard that. You know that we were splitting up. We were going to dissolve the group. It's going to disappear on the 4 winds, okay? But you have a pre-organized, pre-arranged meeting place for site number 2. So you're not just going to go away. You're going to form up again at another place. And the idea is twofold. Number one, have the police running around all over the place as you get your message out. And number 2, imagine that. You got 30 people here, 40 people there. As it goes on in the day, 50 people there. In the minds of people looking at that, they're adding those numbers together. They don't know it's all the same people. They may recognize a few, but the idea is to make your numbers look larger than they are. It's a force multiplier. So they were typically pre-planned, but I got involved, excuse me, with a little conference in my living room with some Black Panthers in which they were discussing the possibility of using public phones. What they wanted to do, I don't know if any of you have ever been to Pittsburgh, but Pittsburgh is a town that has, innumerable small streets leading into it, but the large arteries of traffic, there are about 5 or 6 of them, and all of them go through tunnels or over bridges. So what these guys were going to do, they were going to hijack the appropriate number of gasoline tankers, trailer trucks, semis, and they were going to attach a bomb to them and either drive them into a tunnel, okay, or drive them across a bridge, blocking all 4 lanes, and then detonate them. And we were going through this, and I thought it was interesting. But I thought, and I told them, I said, those public phones, what if you get to a phone and it's busy, somebody's in there? And as I was asking them, I knew what the answer was going to be. Well, we're going to rustle him out of there. We're going to get that phone. Okay. What if it's broke? Well, we checked them. Yeah, but, how many times you get on a public phone, it just doesn't work. So I recommended to them that they invest in, or better yet, get the KGB to invest in some World War II walkie-talkies. And when we left that little get-together, they were discussing the possibility of getting them. Now, I didn't know this at the time. I found out later that was really bad advice for what they wanted to do. The range of these phones, which are available in war surplus stores all over the place in the 60s, the range of these phones is very limited, a few hundred feet to approximately 1 mile over land. I mean, you're doing good if you can hear those things at a distance of a mile, and that's not in an urban area. That's not around buildings and everything. They're only good for 3 miles over open water, so they were getting some inadvertently bad advice. Also, one of the spots that they mentioned was the Liberty tubes, we call them Liberty tunnels, that open out onto the Liberty Bridge, and they had plans for operations at both ends. They were going to blow a truck up in the south end and blow one up across the bridge at the north end. But that south end, and I informed them of this, another piece of erroneous information I was not clear about, I didn't know at the time, but there literally was, a half a mile from that bridge, a company of Army tanks. And I said, that's going to make for a bad day if they get out there. Turned out those were Army Reserve, not National Guard, so I don't know if those would have been something they could have used or not. I seriously doubt it. But the operation never came off, and I like to think now that I had a small hand, if inadvertently, in stopping that operation. That would have, if they pulled that off, the chaos they would have caused in Pittsburgh would still be talked about today. So, excuse me. Moving on to another tactic, or another technique. They were very big on coalition building, and the motto there was use anybody who will work you. I was surprised at the time. I thought, you can't work with religious groups. You guys are all atheists, and none of them are going to work with you. Well, that wasn't the case at all. They would use anybody who would work with them, and apparently those groups were willing to use the communists, because we used Catholic and Protestant peace groups. We used multitudes of black pastors. They didn't have to be our people. They just needed a common interest, even if only temporarily. One of them was a major operation we did. In Pittsburgh, the two rivers, the Allegheny and Monongahela, come together to form the Ohio. And at that point, literally point, is a place called Point Park. It's where Fort Pitt and Fort Duquesne used to be. So it's a good-sized area. And at the time, it had sort of an orchestra shell up there. And they put together an all-day concert. Went from like 11 o'clock in the morning to almost 11 at night. And they had rock bands, they had gospel bands, and the communists had planned it with these black pastors for the most part, but some Catholic and Protestant pastors as well. But, you know, they had the thing all planned out. We played for free again. And they spent the whole day talking to people, inviting them to communist meetings, putting out literature. There must have been a ton of paper literature handed out for the Communist Party. And it was all well received because they were involved in what it was a housing project. They were lobbying and demonstrating for more public housing. And they had anybody interested in public housing at the point that day. And a fun time was had by all, but a lot of material was passed out. So when you see unlikely people sounding like communists, they're either communist movement members, or their people were just co-opted because they have some interest with them, some shared purpose. Now, two more techniques, and the ones people I think of most of the time are, I'll do the short one first, violence against people. That was closely monitored and controlled by the KGB. You all know the KGB is the Soviet secret police, and they did their organizing operations here. But that was closely controlled by the KGB. You either did violence with permission of them or with orders. But if you didn't have either of those, you could get in trouble with that group for being a loose cannon. So I didn't see a lot of violence. It happened later almost at the end of the time I was in the movement. And when you saw it, it was KGB. Using that as a jumping off place, let's move to vandalism, because violence and vandalism went hand in hand. Violence against property, especially business, was another matter from violence against people. Vandalism against property was very, very favored, very, very well promoted by them. Kent State, for instance, the shooting the next day, people, you almost think from the accounts of it that the students showed up, there was a little peaceful demonstration, and all of a sudden out of nowhere, here come the soldiers and 4 dead in Ohio, you know. That's what happened at all. The night before, they went on a major vandalism operation against property, especially businesses. They destroyed the business district of Kent, Ohio. And it was because of that, because the police were unable to control them at all. There were large numbers of them, including organizers, including movement members, and including just hangers-on that wanted to have a good time some night and set something on fire. But they had a large number of people that got out of the control of even the state police. And that night, overnight, the governor got a call and called out the guard in the morning. So that when the students showed up for the demonstration, there was a National Guard. With this instruction, don't let it get out of hand, they torched the place last night. So that was that kind of operation. You see that, the ones you're seeing today with Black Lives Matter and Antifa, that's connected. And I don't know whether KGB doesn't direct the operations anymore because there isn't one, but some higher power organizes, directs, and permits those. This is not spontaneous at all. Now, that leads us up to the highest level. This has all been movement level and intro level, ideological level. But now, what about party membership? Well, I refused to join for a very simple reason, and I told him this frequently. Nixon had an enemies list. Nixon was keeping tabs on people who got to a certain level, and I was in a situation where I was being told that I was going to be moving up that level. So at some point, moving up that list, I was going to end up on Nixon's list. I didn't want that, and I told them that every time. Now, the offer to join the party was only given to those who had proven themselves, and I had proven myself. I was urged, not asked, urged to join, begged to join on several occasions. I recall 3 specific ones offhand. And the reason was that I had that band. And they told me flat out, you and the band are useful, and we need you. What we eventually agreed to, excuse me, was that my band and I would work closely with them anyway, but none of us would join the party. So, and that was a working arrangement that continued till I left the movement. My last orders, as I was considering leaving the movement for a lot of different reasons, one of them I found out early on, they were not interested in just having peace. They wanted to win the war in Vietnam, and we were increasingly being used to further that. But it was specifically the thing that really got me considering leaving the movement was a lot of times I would ask them things, and they would lie. And I would find out the truth somewhere else and come back to them and challenge them. And they would inevitably say, well, you're not far enough along yet. Never far enough along. And what that was telling me, that information was reserved for the party members. Now, if I joined the party, I'd be far enough along. But as a movement member, they couldn't take the risk. But as I was leaving the movement, we received orders from the KGB via this operative by the name of Andre. I'm assuming that was his code name, but he was pointed out to me any number of times. I never was introduced to him, but I saw him countless times. Oh, there's Andre over there. But we received orders from Andre to shift tactics away from the Leninist methods we'd been using. Everything I described at this point was considered Leninist, especially the trailer truck thing and the violence and vandalism. That was all Leninist. But we were told now that the party was shifting toward the methods of Antonio Gramsci. We don't have time to go into Gramsci here. If you're not familiar with him, you need to become familiar with him. But basically, the move was from in-your-face demonstrations and stunts to covert operations involving infiltration. Now, that came on the heels of my being told, this country, this government, this has got to go. It should have been destroyed years ago. Well, now they're telling me we're going to infiltrate and we're going to destroy the system from within. And I'm saying, well, how long is that going to take? Oh, it could be 50 years, could be 100 years. That didn't click. If it's that bad, you don't have time for that. But I didn't voice that to them. I just kept it to myself. And I was told that that would be accomplished by one major move, joining en masse as a group, as the whole movement, joining the Democratic Party because, quote, we have friends there. By the GOP's absence in that discussion, I pretty quickly concluded we did not have friends there. I don't know if I could say that today, but in 1968, 69, 70, and so on, they did have lots. They didn't have friends in the GOP. They had plenty in the Democratic Party. So the goal was to join the Democratic Party and, quote, take it over. And by my reckoning, they had done that by the 1974 election. They were being beaten in the streets in 68, but by 74, they had, selected an anti-war candidate, a pretty far left selection for a political candidate in this country. But the final order was that I was there for. We were told at that point to no longer call ourselves communists. Well, now, I had two interests in communists. One, I was interested in it. It was kind of a prestigious thing to call yourself on the left. And number two, that's where all the girls were. And I wasn't aware that they were migrating with us. But I was not anxious to not be considered a communist at that time. But we were told to call ourselves instead liberals, Democrats, progressive, leftists, even socialists. Anything but communist. Call yourself anything you want. Don't call yourself communist. So, of course, that's all I ever call them. Thank you for listening.